Okay, everyone, good evening. So nice to see such a full room. My name is Mirene Arsanios. I'm the program director here, and it is an extreme pleasure to welcome tonight Ciaran, Finlayson, and Salma Shamel to the Poetry Project. Welcome to both of you. The great thing about the Poetry Project is that you can invite your friends to read. This is part, actually, of the history of the place. It's basically friends inviting friends to read. It also happens that our friends are brilliant and extremely talented, and I'm very happy for this combination tonight. I actually didn't have this in mind when I thought about this pairing, but Salma and Ciaran were in a reading group together in the pandemic era. Sorry if that's not public information, but it's nice that you're back, together in person here tonight. I have no particular announcements. We are next week is Holy Week, so we have no events. But the week after, we're back with a memorial for Fanny Howe. So please come back for that. We have two beautiful books for sale. Perpetual Slavery by Ciaran, and also this other book that that Ciaran edited on Curtis Coffey, and we're going to learn more about this artist tonight. Okay, I think that's it. I also want to thank Jack Gross tonight for introducing Ciaran. Thank you, Jack. So yeah, I'm going to leave him the floor. Ciaran's going to read first, and Salma. Welcome, Jack.
Hi, everyone. So Kay Gabriel sent me some exemplary introductions for previous project readings to help me understand the assignment. And these were all introductions for poets, and their contents made it very clear. They were also introductions by poets. And probably everyone here knows that the poets have a very particular tradition, especially in this institution, of a kind of extravagant one-upmanship, and their mutual appreciation kind of sustains the poetic enterprise through this romantic and florid appraisal of the aesthetic, interpersonal, deliciously florid, aesthetic interpersonal journeys that take place between them and among the words that they write. And so I found myself, as is the goal of these introductions, very moved and amused and also kind of stumped because I'm not a poet. Ciaran's not necessarily a poet either. This reading is billed as two left-wing writers who work in argument and critique and analysis. And our dear friend Ciaran's mode of thinking, to the extent that I can know it, is characterized by a commitment to patience, authoritativeness, acuity, restraint, and a severity of judgment, which I mean in a very positive sense, as in judging severely among various explanations or interpretations, many of which would be wrong, politically, intellectually, aesthetically, poorly matched to their object, and therefore which need to be militated against or displaced by truer ones, which I think Ciaran does in his writing. So to provide some introduction to Ciaran's MO and try and adapt to the form, another friend within the kind of galaxy of reading groups, chats, political projects in which Ciaran and I have developed together over the last nearly decade, I guess. This friend suggested that I make reference to a Brecht text that I hope would be a good match for its object, and the vast and intense interpretive capacities and focus that Ciaran will put on display for us tonight as he reads a paper and shows us some images from the work of the New York City artist Curtis Coffey. And I hope it'll be helpful also because Ciaran's subtlety as a writer and an intellect is genuinely remarkable insofar as he's able to smuggle profound political and conceptual clarity into writing that can feel as clean as description. His essay book, Perpetual Slavery, which you should buy, nice that it's on sale, reads in the Register of Contemporary Art, Writing, and Art History, and is also a broad, inventive, and politically significant work of Marxist criticism on the subject of labor and freedom and of philosophical intervention in debates over Marxism and Black studies, which is not easy to do all at once. So that Brecht text is called Writing the Truth, 5 Difficulties, which are really criteria for thinking and writing in service of the truth, which is to say in service of the intellectual and political project around which so much of Ciarán's life is organized. And so these are the difficulties. 1, the courage to write the truth. 2, the keenness to recognize the truth. 3, the skill to manipulate the truth as a weapon. 4, the judgment to select those in whose hands the truth will be effective. 5, the cunning to spread the truth among many. I think these criteria describe how Ciarán returns circuit-like his political thinking and action into contact with the milieu, field, industry of critical and cultural production that is sometimes very hostile to both thought and action, whereas Ciarán is productive of both. And incidentally, the first version of that Brecht essay, which I think had 3 difficulties and which I will not talk about because I think I've talked for too long already, was entitled Dichter, or Poets Should Tell the Truth. So it is my pleasure to introduce the great poet, militant, and critic Ciarán Finlayson.
Thank you so much, Jack. Thank you for having me at the Poetry Project. I'm going to read from a book that I edited with Robert Snowden and Scott Portnoy about the artist Curtis Cuffey, who, sorry, is this better? Who lived and worked on the street not very far from here from the 80s to the early 2000s. So this essay it's about the book, which gathers the work of a few different photographers, primarily the point-and-shoot photography of his romantic partner, Katie Abel. I'll show the images. The images won't correspond to what I'm describing. Cuffey's sculpture and images are only part of his practice, which had a crucial verbal component as well, very little of which survives. He would improvise stories and songs and poems when he explained the work to visitors. So afterward, we'll watch a very short clip of Cuffey recorded by some NYU undergrads. So Birmingham-based artist Lonnie Holley was also a kind of important reference point for how some people have understood Cuffey's work. So I've got an epigraph from Holley by Baraka because we're at the Poetry Project. As a class expression, the materials Lonnie Holley uses resonate with the socioeconomic real life of not only Black life, but the whole outer inner, constructed from the corpses of American poisoned edges, which is from this great essay, Revolutionary Democratic Art from the Cultural Commonwealth of Afro-America. Much of the beauty of Curtis's work, wrote Carol Thompson in a 2002 eulogy, was in seeing him create it and seeing it unfold from day to day. This book, focusing on Cuffey's public sculptures erected and inevitably torn down across the East Village in the 80s and 90s, presents this beauty as it unfolded in the streets and in photographs taken by the artist himself, his romantic partners, and 2 professional photographers who lived in the neighborhood. Although Cuffey's artwork was exhibited in galleries, museums, alternative art spaces, and nightclubs, his major venues were the fences, sidewalks, and traffic medians of Lower Manhattan. Curtis made art as a daily devotion, Thompson continued. And though many captured his public performances on camera, none did so with the parallel devotion of Katie Abel, who took hundreds of snapshots of Cuffey at work in the mid-90s. Her intimate collection, which she arranged into dozens of albums for Cuffey's brother Alvin and his sister-in-law Peggy, after the artist passed, are at the very heart of this book. Abel, born in Greenwich Village, was living in a loft on Cooper Square that she shared for many years with her partner, the bassist and composer Ciaran from the loft jazz group Liberation Ensemble. Archie Shepp and Amiri Baraka were their neighbors. For 27 years, she worked at the Village Vanguard, in the cloakroom, as a waitress, and as a hostess. She was not, in her words, a photographer before meeting Cuffy in her late 40s. Abel had rarely used a camera in a concerted manner. In fact, the first time she saw his work, she ran to grab a colleague to take photos of it. Upon learning that its maker was a music lover, she gifted him a radio. He asked her on a date for Independence Day. As Abel described it, the events of the 4th were like a fairy tale. They met at a safe distance from the crowds, which Cuffy preferred to avoid, and watched fireworks over the East River. When Abel left to get refreshments, Cuffy converted the shopping cart out of which he lived and worked into a carriage and lifted her into its mass of pillows and blankets and rushed her down the street singing happy holidays to the revelers. Over the years, Cuffy stayed with Abel periodically and stored a number of sculptures in her loft. She would spend hours photographing him as he worked outdoors at different locations in the 90s and early aughts, both in the city and at her house in eastern Pennsylvania, where Cuffy once made a sculpture at the edge of her pond to scare off beavers. To her, he professed a lack of interest in preserving his most ephemeral works, but he encouraged her photography and empathized with the desire to hold on to things in perpetuity, calling her Katie the Keeper. These photographs shot in and around Cooper Square, the Bowery, and Astor Place, where Cuffy would often erect works at the edge of an unsanctioned flea market, subject to near-daily police raids, illustrate how the art lived outdoors and unprotected from the elements. When viewed in sequence, these images have a way of spoiling the idea of sculpture's fixity, permanence, and separability from the artist. Few of these works held place for very long. Most were destroyed by law enforcement, the Department of Sanitation, or the grounds team at the Cooper Union for the Advancement of Art and Science, which would go on to hire Cuffy in 2001. Cuffy moved to Brooklyn in 1970 at age 15 from his hometown, Hartsville, South Carolina. He told several versions of this story. In one, he was sent up north after he'd turned into a goat and started eating clothes off his mother's laundry line. In another, he had sneaked into a local meeting of the Ku Klux Klan, 70 miles northeast of the state capitol, dressed in a white robe. No harm came when he was discovered, but his family decided it was time for him to go stay with his brother Ernest, a social worker in Brooklyn. Cuffy attended John Jay High School in Park Slope before dropping out in the 11th grade and working as a truck driver and hand laborer. He married and had 3 children. When his mother, Jessie Bell Cuffy, passed in 1983, he's said to have entered a deep and protracted depression, losing stable housing and living around Bryant Park. He relocated to the East Village not long after, where he began to make works of art in public. Homelessness is foregrounded in nearly all writing about Cuffy, though he was himself chary about discussing it. He told Sarah Ferguson at the Village Voice that he wasn't homeless but holy, and to curator Tom Patterson, he described himself as holy and free. Cuffy once remarked to Thompson on a drive home from Coney Island that the passing houses looked to him like coffins. Reportedly, he refused help accessing public assistance from his friend Daryl Maupin, owner of the East Village restaurant and club Flamingo East, where Cuffy's first solo exhibition was presented in 1992. About his living conditions, he told The Voice, "I don't think of this street. There is no suffering, no misery, only love." This book's opening images were taken by Tom Warren, a countercultural photographer who participated in landmark exhibitions at ABC No Rio, capturing the early days of the East Village art scene through makeshift photo studios he set up in bohemian spaces around the city. In his images, mostly black and white and shot with a Contax T between 1992 and 1997, Cuffy's works stand resolutely on their own as objects. Self-contained, they take leave of the disinvested landscape, estranged from the pedestrian spheres of trash and commerce on Astor Place. His approach stands in contrast with that of Margaret Morton, a Cooper Union professor who spent the 90s documenting the homes of New York City's homeless in the tradition of socially engaged photography. In Morton's lens, the work emanates from its environment and is inseparable from the teeming life of the city and the realities of the artist's situation. Morton captured the way Cuffey's intricate assemblages of used clothing, broken jewelry, discarded toys, ostrich feathers, and advertisements would mysteriously appear and disappear on the chain-link fence across from the school at 4th Street and the Bowery. She was fascinated by the work's ironic qualities, how it made, quote, wry commentary on the excesses of consumerism, even as it was clearly inspired by refuse and waste. It's been said that every Cooper Union student from this period knew and learned from Cuffey, whose sprawling pieces were often installed around the school's premises. Years later, Morton's photographs of Cuffey and his art were hung in the school's Great Hall at a memorial held 3 months after he suffered a fatal heart attack in his East 10th Street apartment at age 47. This publication closes with a selection of photos taken by Cuffey himself. Throughout the 90s, the artist used a point and shoot to record his art and environs on more than 100 rolls of film. These remained undeveloped in his lifetime and have been safeguarded along with much of the rest of his archive by Thompson, who in addition to being his partner, was also the first art historian to produce scholarship on Cuffey's work. When Thompson began this academic writing in 1996, she had left her job as a curator at the Museum for African Art in Soho to pursue a PhD in performance studies at New York University. Cuffey would sit in on classes she was taking and ones she taught at colleges across the city. He had moved into her 6th floor walk-up on East 10th Street that January, shortly after a historic blizzard, alternating between their shared quarters and life out on the Bowery in the early years of their relationship. Forgoing the hazards of New York City's shelter system, he was known to set up camp downtown above a hot air vent that he named the Sahara and would decorate with floral comforters and dried palm trees. An artist biography Cuffey and Thompson drafted together described his work as an urban variation on rural Southern folk art. In this view, inspired by Robert Ferris Thompson's Africanist readings of contemporary Black American art, Cuffey was a yard artist without a yard. Unlike Joe Minter or Lonnie Hawley, Cuffey owned no property. His work accumulated on public and disused land: the traffic median south of Cooper Square, a boarded-up gas station on East 4th Street, a hurricane fence on the corner of Bowery and Great Jones. After assembling a large piece or a procession of smaller ones, Cuffey would sell the parts, give them away, or rearrange them until being forced to move along by the police. In 1993, writer Chippy Irvine spoke with him about working in such conditions. Every now and then, the weather or the sanitation department removes all of Cuffey's work, and his carts full of beach towels, placemats, fake flowers, and menus that he uses as material. The last time it happened, he was devastated, and he went to church to cry. But then he started all over again. Cuffey's sidewalk sculptures and booming voice had been in Thompson's life since she moved to the East Village in 1988, but they became part of her daily commute when the Center for African Art relocated from the Upper East Side to Soho 5 years later. When they met when she heard him sing Little Red Riding Hood as she walked down the street in a red beret. Thompson helped Cuffey earn recognition within the East Village arts community, curating 2 solo exhibitions of his work at long-standing Black-owned galleries in the neighborhood. Of their working relationship, Thompson wrote, "Cuffey has asked me to write his words down, to tell his story in order to help make his art in his own words fully respected. Don't paralyze my ego. Keep it plain and simple. I'm a country boy." She helped write grants that won him awards and residencies from the New York Foundation for the Arts, the Pollock-Krasner Foundation, and the Lower Manhattan Cultural Council. They took regular trips out of town, to South Carolina and Minnesota to visit each other's families, to Maryland to see his work at the American Visionary Art Museum. A research trip to Burkina Faso, however, was blocked by a spiteful parole officer who refused to let Cuffey leave the country over a technicality. The first solo exhibition Thompson organized with Cuffey took place in 1996 at a gathering of the tribes, a space run by the writer Steve Cannon at an Alphabet City townhouse he bought in 1970 using money made from his infamous pornographic novel Groove, Bang, and Jive Around. Cannon was well known as a community builder and ran his home as a literary salon until his death in 2019. Tribes, remembered by friends and younger poets as the last crash pad on the Lower East Side, formalized as a nonprofit organization in 1990. Cannon set up a literary arts journal and a writing workshop on his stoop. He said, "The people I knew down on the Lower East Side complained about not having any place to publish their work, so I started Tribes magazine just to get them to shut up." His house would become a venue to hosting writers and musicians including Ishmael Reed, Bill Gunn, Butch Morris, and Sun Ra. It was funded in part by donations from friends such as David Hammonds, who wrote the organization's second supporting check and gave comment to the Times for Cuffey's obituary. Quote, "When curators would come from Europe, I would always take them to see Curtis's work or introduce them to Curtis, just to frighten them." In the summer of 2000, Carol would curate another show of Cuffey's work, Heaven is Under Your Feet at 4th Street Photo Gallery, an unassuming storefront rented by South Carolina-born artist Alex Harsley on East 4th Street in Bowery. Harsley opened the space in 1973, 2 years after starting the nonprofit organization Minority Photographers Incorporated. In a video Harsley made of the opening, a saxophonist plays amid an overgrowth of sculpture. The word love is written on a wall in shaving cream. Harsley knew Cuffey from the neighborhood and took photos and footage of him making work near the gallery. In one recording, made along the wall of the Bowery bar, the artist spins quickly, tosses the lid of a coffee tin high into the air, spins again, and catches it. He would send these discs into traffic and dodge the oncoming cars. "The name of the top is Flying Medicine," Cuffey wrote in a note dated July 12th, 1997. "First, I learned it releases me from being lonely and confused. 3 more reasons for the top. Confused, angry, bored. It cures my boredom, it cures my confusion, it entertains my boredom, it takes away my anger. Put it this way, it is like meditation, but in action." Cuffey's risky antics, loud singing, and Delphic interviews all shaped his public persona. When the pair moved in together, Thompson sought professional help for him. Following a period of psychiatric assessment, a doctor suggested to her that he suffered not from schizophrenia, as many had assumed, but from addiction to crack cocaine. In the wake of this realization, Thompson's writing on Cuffey shifted. Unlike the art historical and local color profiles he'd received in publications such as Raw Vision and Art and Antiques, she adopted a new political approach rooted in cultural studies and anti-colonial history. His varied public personalities, relentless generosity, twisting moods, and nearly animistic conception of the objects he would find and rearrange then were defenses against the difficulties of life on the street, a kind of non-ceremonial spirit possession mediated by the narcotic, an Americanized version of the Hauka movement. His hardships, which manifested in his erratic comportment and ethereal work, were being compounded by the Ronald Reagan and Rudy Giuliani administration's wars on drugs. Cuffey got sober the following year. Quote, "Once when I walked by, Curtis was standing facing the wall with arms and legs splayed wide, all the while talking loudly to himself as though being arrested by an invisible policeman," Thompson writes. Between the ages 21 and 42, Cuffey was arrested 31 times. Primarily for gambling, he played 3-card Monte, and drug possession. Though he rarely discussed this aspect of his life, even with close friends, it's expressed in the title of works such as Flag with Handcuffs for the 4th of July. Kenny Schachter, who organized the 1992 Flamingo East show with Maupin, and who from 1991 to 2000 included Cuffey in many buzzy group exhibitions alongside the likes of Sanford Biggers, Rachel Harrison, and Vito Acconci, once appeared in an issue of the Sunday Times holding a Cuffey sculpture beneath his arms. The caption, which identified the work as untitled, upset the artist. "All my works have titles," he said to Thompson. Though most often they were bestowed the moment he parted with the piece. Absent titles to guide them, most visitors to his public installations would have been in the presence of the artist, who would, if he wished, lead them through a complex of allegorical narratives. Quote, "Soft-spoken, almost diffident, Cuffey offered explanations for his constructions only when pressed. However, once launched into a description of a particular piece, he would literally follow the thread or ribbon, string, or wire of his thoughts from one 3D tableau to another. He moved along the sidewalk. His creation stretched along a good 30 feet. He showed me the kitchen of a reckless life. He banged a few of the cheap ruined saucepans he hooked onto the fence and touched a tattered black negligee, which inspired him to comment, 'Too much sex.' Next to it, he said, was the wife going off on her own. As he spoke, he pointed to the kind of shoulder bag that's given away at trade fairs and conventions. Blaring on its side in big white letters were the words, 'Service Business Success.' A foot or two away was the president's phone, a partially disassembled touchstone desktop model neatly installed beneath a large photo of Reagan. US presidents recur across Cuffey's interviews and imagery. In particular, Abraham Lincoln, whom Cuffey revered. He traveled with Abel to see the memorial in DC, and Ronald Reagan, ambiguously referred to by Cuffey as the general. Related to the latter, Cuffey often discussed his own work in salvific tones, occasionally portraying himself as a sort of 80s evangelist. He once told Sarah Ferguson that he traveled to New York with Johnny Cash's ministry, aimed at those struggling with substance abuse, to run a spiritual recycling program under Reagan. The former president figures not only as a symbol of contemporary faith, but as the architect of modern homelessness. Under his administration, the Department of Housing and Urban Development had its budget cut by nearly 70%. That same period saw the broad introduction of mandatory sobriety as a prerequisite for access to public housing. The social crisis these policies induced and its effects on the lives of artists are the subject of much of Alan W. Moore's writing. A 1992 essay by Moore that Cuffey once commended as brilliant closes out this book. It details the successes and shortcomings of the downtown scene's efforts to support the artist's life and rise to the challenge of his work. At this time, Moore had been writing for Tina Anton, whose nonprofit Art on the Edge distributed art supplies to homeless shelters and exhibited and sold the resulting work, and whose commercial gallery, co-run with her husband Arn, focused on self-taught artists. Moore was also researching Hope Sandro's Artists and Homeless Collaborative, an initiative at women's shelters connecting well-known artists with residents to work on public projects, John Edcroft's squatted art gallery, Chocolate Milk, which showed and sold art by the unhoused, and an unnamed theater troupe operating in an encampment beneath the Manhattan Bridge. Moore was himself a member of Collaborative Projects, a democratic artist group that squatted buildings for exhibition space and made polemical collective work addressing the real estate industry. In light of this historical interest in art by and about the homeless, highlighted by Moore's work, Cuffey's sculptures should be understood not only in terms of their plastic inventiveness, their celebrated contributions to radical assemblage and found object installation, but within a continuum of East Village contemporaries that includes its squatters, hardcore musicians, and art activists, the community of homeless artists that brought Cuffey to the attention of gallerists, an older generation of Black avant-gardists, and the heady post-conceptualists of Lower Manhattan. This confluence structured the downtown scene in which Cuffey's work was first received and provides the context in which it should be understood today. Inspired by the motto engraved in the cornerstone of the Salvation Army Bowery Corps, dedicated to the service of God and humanity, Cuffey regarded his work as his mission. He was gathering lost souls on St. Mark's Place and offering them a chance at reincarnation, giving mistreated objects new life through elaborate tableaux of disillusion and salvation. But the work is equally concerned with history, intervening on that centuries-old byway of social murder known as the Bowery. In his expressive recasting, the streets disjecta membra become delicate, suspensive constructions in which, to quote Benjamin, a car is no heavier than a straw hat and no more precious. Cuffey's art, surviving mostly in memory and in these photographs, transgressed the rule of property and transvaluated poverty, both the artist's and the world's, confronting Manhattan's deprivations through its own vagrant, transverberative life. And now we'll watch the short video.
All right. Take pictures, man. Take pictures. Bring it out. You free. Take pictures. We're not wearing now. Hey, Mom, keep an eye on those bags.
Yes, I will.
Never mind. Keep it out of the equipment. Okay? As I said, long time ago, there was a lady, old lady in the shoe. And it's very damn time. That old lady still in the shoe. And the last message I heard from that old lady in the shoe was this. One of these days, these boots are gonna walk all over you. You keep saying you got amnesia, yeah. But I am having point of view trouble too. The shoemakers say we're gonna make a brand new pair of shoes, yeah. They made the clogs, the loafers, even hush puppies too. Oh, hubby said I don't drag my heels, and heels hit the ground and still. One day the ant slipper came along and slipped up wrong. Wrong thing, yeah. I pull my ear gently, because I don't wear earrings. I wear a long dress because I'm not stylish. Well, I respect the reason of hibernation. I come back to this old foundation, Grandma still lives. I got a face with no face in time. I got a foundation that's thick. I got a box of coffin. And when I open it up, it's still. The invisible man named Houdini, he's still around. Today we buried a good man. What? Ain't no lie. When he closed the coffin for the last awakening, called in. What happened to Houdini? A mystery still. The great state about it says hi. But still, yeah, we're gonna break it on down like this, y'all kids. What you have here is an old fool. And right now, that old fool's still young and old at the same time. Cool. The foundation of this whole thing here is keep the faith. Ain't one people, one love. One David, one star. But as Rabbi would say, one unity under God, one nation. Thank God for hibernation, reincarnation. But damn, thank God for still crazy after all these years. And my name's Paul, and I'm with the crew. God bless you all. Thanks. Yeah.
Thank you, Ciaran. So great. Also to think about the East Village as we celebrate next fall our 60th anniversary. So think about all that was happening around this place. Okay. It is now my great honor to introduce Salma. Yes. I'm going to read her formal bio. And Jack, you made me so self-conscious about introduction styles. Very interesting. Okay. Salma Shamel is a writer and scholar working at the intersection of critical theory, Marxism, psychoanalysis, and Arab intellectual history. She received her PhD from New York University in August and is currently a collegiate assistant professor at the Harper Schmidt Fellow at the University of Chicago. Her writing has appeared in Parapraxis, Endnotes, Social Texts, Rethinking Marxism, and the Los Angeles Review of Books, among others. Okay. Salma is my friend, someone who has seen and accepted the most tragic parts of me, and who, for that same reason, inspires in me the desire to give her all the good I have. I'm being personal here, but also not. I'm talking about Salma's writing, its invitation to confront our most ancient pain by attending to the form of its repetitions. Even screaming, a primal expression of hurt, must be made sense of in order to be fully felt. Perhaps, she writes of her mother's handling of her disabled brother's relentless cries, quote, "This is why she wanted the scream to unfold indefinitely, without repression or intervention, to return and pierce through the original act of numbing," end of quote. The unspeakable and the untranslated are lazy categories, and Salma is not a lazy writer. She is committed in her work to making our pain intelligible, not necessarily to transform it, but at least to make us less, quote, numb to our own self-suffering. In other words, reading Salma is like making a new friend. You will give her your trust because she takes that same risk with you. The risk of taking our social and bodily wounds seriously, rigorously, rendering the conditions that have produced them felt in language rather than simply exposed in thought. And for this, she has my most profound admiration. Her genuine commitment to theory is inseparable from the stakes of lived experience, while also refusing to concede to the primacy of suffering as the ultimate argumentative weapon. You can't understand me if you're not me. True, my pain is in your pain. You will never understand what it's like to be a ghost, and Salma will tell you why. But we must build an effective and social infrastructure to make our experiences universally shareable, converging in their demand for a just and fiercely giving world. Universal is a word that Salma uses shamelessly by demanding that its exclusionary and extractive applications be made accountable to the particulars it owes its existence to. Theory is a tool like any other tool. Wittgenstein is mine, she says. Marx is mine too. Salma wields Western philosophy to serve her own ends, that is to say, an end that serves us all. And she does so in exquisitely playful prose by looking at how language works, how it collides like a car crash against its own logic. Quote, "Syria will be like Afghanistan, it will be like Iraq, it will be like Libya." End of quote. Yet here, in the heart of empire, no man can know what it's like to be a woman, she writes in her piece, The End of Equivalence. Similes reiterate an order in which the colony is lumped in a mass of undifferentiated brownness, whereas empires radiates with shiny singularity. In another essay, she tests the metaphor against the simile. Quote, "Does he know what a golden mountain is? Can he bring together in his mind the idea of gold and the idea of mountain?" she asks her mother in a desperate attempt to understand her disabled brother. It is these language operations that Salma taunts in her writing, placing two words side by side, creating a third image that can be anticipated, an act of language producing an effect that neither the idea of mountain nor the idea of gold can respectively contain. Poets do this all the time, but Salma gets there logically by following an observation that leads to a question, the same way a child, bewildered yet stubborn, tries to match the literalness of stuff with more abstract categories. It is there, with and against the material thing, that the poetics of her writing happens, a thinking process anchored in wonder, but also not entirely satisfied by it. An homage to the philosophers we all were when we were 5, asking why? I'm in my 40s now, writing this on a Tuesday, wondering how to end this introduction, coming back from a session with Azine on the F train, switching to the Q at West 4th. I text Salma, who's in Chicago, to debrief about Travis, my powerlessness with money, my resistance to aging. I can talk to her forever because her mind is infinitely expansive. Traumatized, yet therapized enough to transform hypervigilance into deep, loving inquiry. I don't know of any other writer who can articulate as convincingly as Salma the connections between our private suffering and the disbanded, broken world. How, if you keep asking why, you'll realize that they're kind of the same thing. And if you stop asking why and take a leap beyond the question, try connecting two things that have no apparent relation, like silk and the sea, or a mountain and gold, even if such things don't exist. You can trust poetry to physically alter your mind and your heart. Perhaps it is this risk, the risk of poetry, that Salma is about to take. Please join me in welcoming her to the stage.
Can I get a transcript to this? I'll have it for my grant applications. My work confronts the most ancient pain. And, thank you so much, Mirene. Really grateful. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Mirene. Thanks, Will and Kay and Anna, Nicole, Roberto, Heather, everyone at the Poetry Project. Thank you so much. This place was my refuge 10 years ago when I first arrived in New York City, and I'm very happy to be here. So I'm going to read from my book manuscript, one longer essay, and two short pieces, and maybe some excerpts from a longer essay. The book deals with disability, experience, ideas of likeness, sameness, equivalence, among other things. The first essay is titled, "No One Will Ever Know What It's Like to Be a Ghost." My mother passed out on the night of December 22, 1984, when her gynecologist, tipsy at a Christmas gathering, mistakenly directed the nurse over the phone to give her a general anesthetic instead of a local one. When the doctor arrived in the morning, he delivered a baby that was, in medical slang, a blue baby. My brother was blue, they explained to my mother, because of a heart anomaly, which would improve with an incubator. In Al Ahram newspaper, my family wrote a thank you letter to the doctor who also owned the hospital. Months later, the newborn felt floppy in his mother's arms. His head wouldn't stay up, his bones were contorting. He wasn't able to walk or talk or recognize anyone. Doctors in Amsterdam, London, New York, Boston, and Istanbul diagnosed differently than Cairo. His heart was fine. This was total brain damage, and it had happened during delivery. Deprived of oxygen, the living cells in the newborn's brain had all died, except for a few, placing him for the next 38 years at the limit between dying and being dead. At a talk many years later, I heard the philosopher Jalal Tawfiq say, "To die before dying is to become aware of what one is already, dead while still physically alive, immortal." Immortal is a subject that is subject to death and has the dead alive in him. At 5, I was like Thomas in Caravaggio's St. Thomas painting, but my distrust was different. Unlike Thomas, whose index finger pierced Jesus' wound, refusing to believe without direct physical evidence, I probed my mother's deepest wound for abstract concepts. I asked her whether my brother knew what color was, if he understood what a bad odor smelled like. Does he know what a golden mountain is? Can he put together in his mind the idea of gold and the idea of a mountain? Does he belong to the world of things, inorganic and raw, or the world of humans and language? Why do I recognize him while he doesn't recognize me? And how come he doesn't recognize you, his own mother? I wanted to hear about cognition, recognition, causes, and consequences. Sometimes my mother would burst into tears, but most often she gave elusive answers. My mother never talked about disability or institutional accountability. Go to God, talk to God. If God wills, he will get better. I believed that God would do it for me, so I prayed and waited and signaled to God that this was the perfect time for his intervention. I would wake up in the middle of the night to check whether my brother had finally gotten up. I believed that God would do it for me, so I waited. Mattresses were changed, blankets shuffled, yet his body lay in the same corner of the living room for 38 years. My mother didn't admit my brother to a hospital because she didn't trust hospitals. She turned into an institution when no institution could be a mother. My brother never had an ID card because he never encountered a policeman. His eyes never locked with mine. He had the bed sores of a 90-year-old at the age of 12. Unmoving organs and bones, heavily pressing on the skin into a tender halo of pinkish white. The absence of mutual recognition left me in a state of one-sidedness that transformed in my teen years into a feeling of innate superiority. Fucking monster was all over my diary pages. At home, I refused to sit in the living room claiming the smell of his drool made me nauseous. At school, his screaming rang in my ears. I had a bone-deep fear at the thought of a friend seeing his postural deformities, his pelvic obliquity, and his right foot that had severely turned in and upwards. I hid him from every side and lied at every occasion. My brother goes to a neighboring school, his midfield on the soccer team, listens to Joy Division, has a half-English girlfriend. Two friends once dragged me to a soccer field during a visiting school tournaments. That's him, with short Liberty spikes. I played porno on TV, increasing the volume, and opened his diapers to see if he would get an erection. To lie is to assume a horizontal position, but it's also to deceive. At times, I thought he was pretending that his entire existence was a lie. At others, I lay in twisted positions next to him on the floor, staring at the same part of the ceiling, daring myself not to move a single muscle. I tirelessly tried to collapse the distance between his experience and mine, to flatten our separate worlds into a deflated one. If only I could get out of myself to know what it would feel like to be in his body. If only I could get to be a living corpse, a ghost person, to live a life devoid of life. Only then could I make sense of his experience. Decades without language, being him was the only way of being with him. Decades later, I learned that the drive to collapse our differences would repeatedly yield a deadlock, that immediate experience cannot be the only premise of knowledge, and that there are ways we can feel and relate to each other without being one another, and that there is a necessity for being different. I'm not sure if I failed talking to God because I failed at talking to my brother, or if I failed at talking to my brother because I failed at talking to God. I mastered the art of counting and cost-benefit analysis. Like the capitalist during COVID who deemed the elderly unworthy of ventilators, I quantified my mother's care and could not grasp the imbalances. The number of times she had fed him, 3 times a day times 30 days a month, equals 90 times 12 months a year, equals 1080 times 20, 25, 30, and now 38 years. Today she has fed him 40,040 times. I did not understand why my mother severed equality of value from equality of capabilities. How come I received incomparably less when I was worth much more? What are economies of worth linked to? For a while, I thought that my mother and I had incompatible orders of worth. I saw worth linked to the social spheres, mutual recognition, school, and love. And she saw it linked to the necessary burden for the continuation of life. Much later, through the work of Marx, I understood that these orders weren't so separate. When I arrived in the US for graduate school, the classroom was dominated by a theory ashamed of human consciousness and agency. Can the mosquito speak? Can the scallop critique? Do pipelines have agency? The aim was to create a pre-critical, pre-modern, pre-individuated world where humans and non-humans are just equal actors in a free-floating monistic blob. A theory that could only be achieved by pre-modern discourses, a kind of spiritualism without gods, as Zizek would say. Although anti-humanism was nothing new, Heidegger, Freud, Nietzsche long ago told us that humans are primarily driven by irrational and unconscious desires, I found the discussions in the classroom more barren, more bleak. My frustration came out in Skype calls with my mother, who hated nothing in life more than philosophy. Mom, my peers want to get rid of the human. They want a philosophy of infantile minds, infant from Latin, meaning not, and fant, meaning fairy speaking, not speaking and not judging. They claim consciousness belongs to the world of modernity. My mother, never interested in concealing her lack of interest, responded, well, that's how the West is. But you cannot get rid of something you've never had. My mother missed the point. The issue wasn't the West giving up universal categories it once imposed. In Juridical Humanity, Samira Ismir argues that the logic of colonialism is violent because it posits humanity as something that can be confiscated or given. It declares to humanize as if the colonized were never human to begin with. The violence for her is that this project of humanization erased a broader Islamic mystical view of the human that had nothing to do with our narrow definition of consciousness and agency. The human was, quote, the organic and inorganic, stars, rocks, and plants, end quote. It was, quote, the stone and the mountain, end quote. The violence of colonialism, she argues, was not exclusion from universal categories, but inclusion into it. And in such inclusions, other traditions were eradicated. The way out then, for her and many post-colonial thinkers, was to reject universalism, to get rid of universals and return to the world of tradition. But which tradition to rescue and which universal to eliminate? Is a unity with the world without any differentiation or understanding of autonomy, dignity, and alienation what we actually need? Is universal humanity a one-sided concept that has to be purged wholesale? We actually need the universal to be able to speak to one another about the hypocrisy of sharing the same world with different standards, to be able to point to the exception. To dwell in the exception is to become aware of what the universal is, a porous conception never fixed, available for us all to challenge, modify, and alter. We don't need unity with the world, we need responsibility. Rocks and stars and rivers cannot stop the hoarders, cannot release abducted immigrants, and cannot build institutions to house and care for those who need it. Unlike rocks that can pile up on the shore or animals that can roam the streets for sustenance, my brother's existence is founded on my mother's labor, on her ability for life creation. Those who create life and those who are prevented from creating their own lives have a lot more in common than we think. In a way, severely exploited workers who make the lives of others possible and impaired individuals who are not able to make their own lives possible shared similar worlds. The former's value is their extractable ability, and the latter's non-value is their unextractable disability. This is perhaps what it means to make the reproduction of life common to all, an idea I have encountered in the work of the Soviet philosopher Ilyankov, who was one of the main figures behind a Soviet experiment centered on the study of disability through Marxist analysis in the 1960s. The human universal for Ilyankov was not a modern category of pure freedom or a detached form of reasoning. The human universal was the figure of an impaired child, a figure to open the seemingly self-referential nature of what it means to be able in a capitalist world, to open up what life really means. To keep the disabled alive is to become aware of what life already is, an ability to prevent the dead from dying, a continuation of organic life. Last year, one of my closest friends in Egypt was arbitrarily arrested and held in solitary confinement. Weeks later, he was luckily released as a result of international pressure, unlike thousands of others left to rot in Egyptian prisons. When I spoke to him on the phone, he told me how the conversations with prisoners across the hallway had kept him sane, and how he had formed intimate relationships with people he had heard but never seen. He describes his inmates' voices asking through the walls whether they would be given mattresses and blankets, whether they would be given food, and whether they would be allowed to tell their families of their arrest. There was something striking in the way he narrated his experience during these weeks. Even though they went through similar, almost identical experiences of arrest, he told me how his prior knowledge as a criminal justice researcher, the fact that he knew about the conditions of Egyptian prisons before actually being in one, he knew he was not getting a mattress, he knew he was not getting a meal. And this, in a way, made his experience different, made it less violent. He knew, in a way, before actually knowing. To know before actually knowing is to become aware of what experience really is. An open conception that cannot be understood outside of difference, language, and mediation. In his History and Freedom lectures, Adorno tells his students the story of his house being searched by the police in Nazi Germany. The experience of such an event, where one might vanish without a trace or run for their life, is much graver than any explanation a newspaper can offer or any theory can provide. In other words, when we experience something, this immediate knowledge has the capacity for greater meaning for us than any other source of knowledge, be it pure theory or news. The problem is that this immediate knowledge, which is important to hold on to, is nothing more than our own immediate experience. It can only be grasped within a larger context, which then manifests itself in these individual facts. Adorno says something crucial here. He could not have experienced the house search the way he did had he not linked it in his mind to the changes in the government, the emergency laws made permanent by the Nazis, and the abolition of safety measures he previously knew about. If all that has happened, he writes, was that, quote, two relatively harmless officials belonging to the old police had turned up on my doorstep, and if I had no knowledge of the complete change in the political system, my experience would have been quite different from what it was, end quote. And similarly, no one can fully grasp the terrors of an authoritarian regime if he had not experienced that ominous knock at the door to find the police waiting outside. There are rarely any words that we use, even in the most mundane moments of our day, that do not point beyond immediate experience. In the US, I first encountered the political discourse of staying in your lane, widespread everywhere, in which legitimation comes primarily from who you are, from your position, so to speak, and not from the force of what you say. One frequently hears sentences such as, "No man can know what it's like to be a woman," "No white can know what it's like to be a black person," "No straight person can know what it's like to be queer," "What it's like to be, what it's like to be, what it's like to be," "What's going on with all the likeness?" Why begin by valuing likeness and sameness and almost magically, by one's own logic, arrive at the self-disappointing thesis that two things can never truly be alike, that no one can really know what it's like to be another. These insular discourses produce political dead ends. I lived most of my life not knowing what it was like to be a ghost. The ghost has taught me that the real is more complex than the experience of hearing the doorbell ring and finding security personnel. The real is the nature of the system as a whole that makes it possible for policemen to abduct us from our homes, to live in a world where disabled bodies are cloistered, where exploited workers become disabled, where mothers turn into institutions, and where racism and sexism infiltrate our every relation. No one will ever know what it's like to be anyone else. There will always be a body more discriminated against. False immediacy convinces us to take experience and turn it into an absolute. Our work is neither to negate it in favor of mediation, nor to exaggerate mediation. It is simply to say that we can keep the tension between both. I'm now going to read a shorter piece that I wrote a week after the fall of Bashar al-Assad, the tyrant of Syria, in case you don't know. He's in Russia, yeah. It's called The Ends of Equivalence. When revolutions happen, people are present, and when revolutions fail, the very same people question their presence. In the aftermath of a failing revolution, there's a failing of belief. And in the failing of belief, events in Syria teach us that some things have no beginnings and no ends, that emancipation can never be contained in squares and seasons, that in fact springs extend into winters, that it can take 13 years and have to erupt outside centers. I hear him here in the center, the masters of equivalence. I hear him equating the secular father to the secular son, the son to the holy state, a state of eternity, stating that this is the price to pay, or else Syria will turn out like Afghanistan, like Iraq, like Libya. Outside empire, all is identical. Inside empire, all is identity. Beware those who forecast the present as identical to the past, a changing same and an unchanging same, undifferentiated forms of similarity, where certainty tames the historical event, turning its contingency into constancy, flattening its turning points into lines of equivalence. Syria will be like Afghanistan, it will be like Iraq, it will be like Libya, yet here no man can know what it's like to be a woman, no white can know what it's like to be black, no straight person can know what it's like to be queer. Outside of empire, all is identical. Inside it, all is identity. There, every state is like another. Here, every self is like no other. Sameness for the post-colony and singularity for the metropole. Look, the Big Dipper. We have the ability to look at the smallest group of the brightest stars to turn it into the largest long-handed spoon. The drinking gourd to guide through the longest routes. We have the ability to look for fleeting similarities in the non-similar and turn more like the world as the world turns more like us. I want neither singularity nor sameness. I want to find likeness within the seemingly different and differentiate the undifferentiated sames. I want us to push back against the binds of this empire that values nothing but the either or perhaps I want to write in the body of this text, on the silk of the seas and the Arctic flowers, and in the margins make a note, there's no such thing. Because only we can create affinities between the silk and the seas and the Arctic flowers, and at the same time dissolve them. There's no such thing. The child who plays is not only a firefighter, but also a windmill and a train. The child loses himself in likeness to discover what he might like to become. He knows what it would be like to be a windmill and what it could be like to be a train. And yet, if you ask him, is the train like a windmill? He will stare at your equivalence in disbelief, for why would you subtract him, the agent, who could be both a windmill and a train? He is the windmill, he is the train, and he is who makes things similar or different and turns an unbearable world more bearable. Syria will be like Libya, only if you subtract the world of its people. This is also another shorter piece. It's called A Tale of a Tail in a Mouth. A Senegalese immigrant mother in France is accused of murdering her 15-month-old daughter in the film Saint-Omer, which is set in a courtroom and follows her trial. The mother on the stand is a PhD student writing her dissertation on Wittgenstein, an academic detail she's shamed for in the trial. Her university professor is called to testify. The professor comes and wonders with skepticism, why did she have to work on Wittgenstein? Why not work on a philosopher who is closer to her own culture? Wait a second, what is closer to Senegalese culture? Is it Guinean culture? But what is closer to Guinean culture? Is it Ivorian culture? But what is closer to Ivorian culture? Is it Ghanaian culture? What is closer to Ghanaian culture? Is it Togolese culture? But what is closer to Togolese culture? Is it Beninese culture? But what is closer to Beninese culture? Is it Nigerian culture? But what is closer to Nigerian culture? Is it Libyan culture? But what is closer to Libyan culture? Is it Greek culture? Of course not. Culture cannot cross oceans, cannot cross seas. Culture cannot cross oceans, cannot cross seas, but it can sidestep 2,000 years. Like the 2,000 years between a Greek antiquity and the European Renaissance, now a hungover era, a haze. European philosophy tells a myth where the beginning and the end are one. It starts in Greece and ends in Europe, like Escher's hand, which drew a hand that drew a hand that drew the hand into existence, a tradition forever constituting itself. It draws itself to drown the other. European philosophy only began referring to itself in the 18th century, when Europeans began to mine our lands. To mine another's land, they needed a rational bourgeois identity different from the Middle Ages and the metaphysical East. A myth based on a haze, based on disavowal of those who passed ideas from one point to another. The Greeks never claimed to have invented philosophy. Descartes told you that Arabic algebra was central to formal reason. Persian ideas of dualism influenced pre-Socratic metaphysics. Indian mathematics made logical analysis possible. European philosophy is like a liar who tells you he's lying. If he is really lying, then he is telling the truth. And if he's telling the truth, then he just lied. European philosophy is a self-referential lie. Adam Smith's questions in The Wealth of Nations did not emerge from reading economic pamphlets distributed in Scotland, England, or Wales. His dilemma began with moral debates about private property and the rights of the excluded. First raised by the Italian Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas himself was deeply influenced by the Andalusian Ibn Rushd, whose translations of Aristotle were central to the creation of Western thought. The free market and the invisible hand are concepts entangled in a world where the West cannot be in any serious way opposed to the rest. To think that ideas about capitalism emerged in a confined West is to sidestep 2,000 years. Why not work on a philosopher who is closer to her own culture? The demand to identify with an impossible account of authentic culture hides behind the lie of the possessive own culture. As if historically colonized people can own their culture, self-contained, unaffected, and untarnished. As if Nike sweatshops had left Vietnamese and Indonesian culture unchanged and self-contained. As if German companies had left Namibian lithium unmined and unaffected. And as if imperialism and global capitalism had not created interdependence across every inch of this world, forging centuries-long connections between disparate peoples and places. Wittgenstein for the self and lithium from the other. To own one's culture, one has to create a myth, and a myth is impossible without the collapse of time, without origins becoming ends. Like the tale of return that returns the old new nation 3,000 years later to its old new land. It returns with its tail in its own mouth. What are 3,000 years if one is chosen? What are 2,000 years if one is rational? I keep the mining in my mind to remember I can never own a mind. Now I'm going to finish with excerpts from a longer piece. It's also about the ghost. If my family had a compass, anesthesia would be its rose. Hold the compass horizontally close to your body and turn it until the magnetic needle aligns. The north towards feeling, the south towards hills of unfeeling. My mother often tells me that if she hadn't been wrongly anesthetized, then our family would have lived a different life. If she had not been absent during my brother's delivery, she would have been more present as a mother. Perhaps this is why she wanted the scream to unfold indefinitely without repression or intervention, to return and pierce through the original act of numbing. But what is the value of an individual scream in a world where screaming has, for decades, been repressed? The value of a scream has changed as our world has gone through a sharp shift in the experience of suffering. In a book about anesthesia, I highlight a passage stating that doctors were uniformly horrified by the gruesome body count of the Industrial Revolution. In hospital reports, machinery was a category of disease. Injury of factory workers made surgical wards look like field hospitals. There appeared the surgeon, the composer who put together the fragmented limbs of industrialism. And there was anesthesia, which not only relieved the patient, but also relieved the surgeon from experiencing the suffering of the patient. There was no need to desensitize oneself against the experience of seeing another suffering. A surgeon can confront an insensate mass to be cut and manipulated without emotion. Last November, I spent some nights smoking cigarettes outside the Georges Pompidou Hospital in Paris. I had never before experienced knocks at doors as the knocks of French nurses at the doors of end-stage cancer patients. They storm in the room so brave and confident, as if their optimism might reverse the effect of the opioid they administer. Regarde tout cet amour, they tell my friend while looking at his friends, who flew in from 3 continents to make him mint tea, peel a clementine, help him get dressed to smoke his last cigarettes. You see this thing? It's important to learn its name, Boulous, my friend told me the first day I arrived, grabbing his analgesia control with a square blue button. Morphine, I read in the middle of the night in a sleeping bag next to my friend, did not have practical implications for surgery until mid-century. In fact, it was a leading children's drug throughout the 19th century. Mothers working in factories drugged their children as a form of daycare. I wanted to tell the working mothers of the 19th century that my mother, having been wrongly drugged during childbirth, ended up in eternal daycare. That I can hear the screams of their children and the screams of my brother. Morphine, I read in the middle of the night, was originally named Morphium, after the Greek god of dreams, Morpheus. Morpheus was able to shape form and morph the minds of dreamers, sending them human shapes and forms of every kind. We come into life in different forms but leave in similar ones. I saw my friend morph into my brother as they started to resemble one another. Their stomachs swelled, their muscles disappeared, and care continued. The form was the same, but I felt a lot more pain towards my friend than I had ever felt toward my brother. What does language do to make us relate more to the suffering of a friend than the suffering of a brother? To suffer for Marx in the economic and philosophic manuscripts is to be corporeal sensuous. Man, for Marx, unlike animals, feels that he suffers. And because he feels that he suffers, he is a passionate being. Passion is a central category for any revolution. Despite workers' daily experience of suffering and pain, exhaustion, boredom, depression, and anxiety, they do not feel suffering for what it is. The capacity to feel one's own suffering is dulled by capital's obsessive, objective tendencies. Strangely enough, one of the gravest mistranslations of Marx is in this realm of feeling. In the English version of Capital, translated by Ben Fowkes, Selbstgefühl der Arbeiter is translated as the class consciousness of the worker. But Selbstgefühl neither refers to class nor to consciousness. Selbst is self, and Gefühl is feeling, to feel. It is the self-feeling of the workers. Not the worker who is conscious of her place, but the one who radically feels her own self-suffering, the one who in consciousness feels, and in feeling is conscious of herself. The much harder work is not exposing capitalist relations, but making them felt. There's nothing redemptive or emancipatory in suffering. Suffering in and of itself will not produce anything. To give voice to suffering is to create the psychological and material conditions whereby suffering itself can speak, can be felt by others. It is to make those numbed to their self-suffering feel their self-suffering. Thank you.
That was so beautiful, Salma. Thank you so much. Thank you, Ciaran, for reading as well. Thank you, Jack, for a beautiful introduction. I also want to thank the Poetry Project staff working tonight, Will, Kay, and Heather as staff support, Pedro at the sound table, Gary at videography, as well as all our volunteers. Thank you all for coming, and I hope to see you soon at the Poetry Project. Thank you.